They said I was too emotional for leadership. So I smiled, took the severance, and built a startup that siphoned their top clients one by one. Now I'm hosting their annual conference as the keynote speaker. Hello, thank you for your support. This means a lot to us. We're on a journey to our first 100 subscribers. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel. It will be great if you can leave a comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout out in our next story. Today's special shout out goes to Joanna Palmer from Atlanta. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's dive into the details of today's story. They didn't even look me in the eye when they said it. 3 men and 1 woman, all neatly arranged around the walnut boardroom table like museum pieces, stiff, expensive, and expressionless. Their mouths moved, but it wasn't a conversation. It was a choreography. Words like alignment, tone, emotional maturity spilled out in rehearsed cadence. I sat perfectly still, palms sweating beneath the polished surface, forcing my lips to stay neutral while my insides roared. The woman from HR, Melissa, with her soft voice and weaponized empathy, told me it wasn't personal. We just need leadership that models regulation under pressure, she said, folding her hands like a prayer. The CEO nodded like he'd just solved world peace. I'd built the entire client retention framework that saved us during Q3. I was the one who pulled double shifts during the cyber breach. But none of that mattered now because I'd raised my voice once, when my junior analyst was blamed for a numbers error that wasn't hers. Because I didn't smile during a client dinner. Because I made them uncomfortable by being right too directly. So now I was being asked to sign a mutually agreed upon transition document. That was the language. Legal, clean, cruel. Afterward, I walked out like my shoes were made of glass. The elevator was too quiet, and the silence made it worse. My reflection in the mirrored walls looked like someone I didn't know, professional, crisp, composed, but my heartbeat said otherwise. I stood there gripping the envelope, the one with the severance details, until my knuckles turned white. I should have cried. I wanted to, but something colder settled in instead. Not rage, no, not yet. Just a kind of clicking noise inside me, like a combination lock turning into place. When I reached the lobby, I smiled at the receptionist, Ava, 19, always too kind, and told her I'd left my charger upstairs. I hadn't. I just wanted one last excuse to walk that hallway, to feel the weight of it, to say goodbye on my terms, even if only in silence. When I reached my office, the door was already unlocked. Melissa had been thorough. The cardboard box on my desk was insulting. I didn't even have that many personal items. One framed photo of my sister and me at the lake. A stress ball I never used. A dried lavender sachet someone gave me when I got promoted. I stood there for a long moment, letting the air settle. Then I opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. The one only I used. The one no one ever asked about. Inside was a leather-bound journal, half filled with scribbles and sketches of an idea I'd been playing with for over a year. It wasn't even a business plan yet. More like emotional breadcrumbs. A problem I knew existed. A solution I hadn't fully articulated. I tucked it under the photo frame and closed the box. That's when I knew, truly knew, they hadn't taken anything from me. They'd just lit a match under something that had already been drying in the dark. I went to the goodbye drinks they planned for me, just to watch them sweat. It was in the corner bar across the street. Dim lighting, curated sadness, overpriced whiskey. People hugged me with stiff arms and fake smiles, whispering how unfair it all was, how I'd land on my feet. I nodded and sipped slowly, counting every insincere compliment like beads on a rosary. One by one, the same people who sat silent in meetings while my ideas were dismissed now lined up to praise my courage. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to. I wasn't feeling courageous. I was feeling something much sharper. I watched them like a scientist watches a specimen. Saw who avoided my eyes, who lingered too long, who watched my reaction to every word like they were waiting for a meltdown. But I gave them none. Just a measured smile, a quiet toast, and a graceful exit. I went home alone that night. The city washed in blue and amber from the passing streetcars. I didn't turn on the lights when I walked in. Just dropped the box on the kitchen table and sat beside it, still in my blazer, heels biting into my ankles. My phone buzzed twice. My mother, asking if I was coming over for dinner tomorrow, and my old coworker Jenna texting, "WTF just happened?" I didn't reply. Instead, I opened the journal, flipped past the sketches, the half-baked diagrams, the bullet points of half-thoughts, and I started writing. I didn't know what I was building yet, not exactly, but I knew who I was building it for. The ones like me, the ones discarded when they didn't perform like machines, the ones who felt too much, cared too deeply, and were told that made them liabilities. I wasn't done. I was just beginning to aim. I didn't make an announcement. No exciting next chapter post, no farewell email. I left like a ghost, slipping through cracks they didn't know existed. In a world obsessed with visibility, silence became my power. I deactivated LinkedIn, turned off notifications. My email auto-reply was blank, cold, and final. I packed up my one-bedroom apartment in a single night and moved 4 cities away. Somewhere smaller. Somewhere I could think without running into someone who still called me powerful, like it was a compliment and not a caution. I didn't tell anyone but my sister. She showed up that morning with coffee and duct tape and didn't ask questions. Just helped me wrap my life in newspaper and cardboard. I left behind everything except the journal, my laptop, and one suitcase. They could keep the corner office. I was building something they'd never understand. At first, I didn't know what my days were supposed to look like. I wasn't used to stillness. My hands kept searching for tasks, schedules, metrics, meetings to prep for. But there were none. Just the hum of an old fridge and the echo of a second-floor walk-up that smelled faintly of dust and eucalyptus. I made a ritual out of the mundane. Coffee at exactly 7:43, morning walks without a destination, returning to the same corner bookstore where the owner never asked what I did for a living. That part mattered. I needed to forget who I'd been in their eyes. Not forever. Just long enough to remember who I was before I learned to smile through humiliation and soften every truth. Some days I sat on the floor with my laptop open and stared at the blinking cursor until the sun dipped below the window ledge. Other days I filled entire pages in the journal with ideas that made no sense, lines connecting problems to emotions to outcomes like emotional cartography. I wasn't building a company yet. I was learning how to be human again. Money was tight. The severance helped, but pride didn't pay the bills. I picked up contract work under an alias, copy editing for tech blogs, writing executive summaries for consultants who didn't know how to articulate their own strategies. It was quiet, thankless, and strangely soothing. No one knew who I was. I wasn't too emotional. I was efficient, anonymous, invisible. And in that invisibility, something started to grow. I tracked patterns in client behavior from old public data sets, looking for fractures, companies losing engagement, revenue dips tied to poor retention strategies, gaps between mission statements and actual outcomes. I built a spreadsheet that tracked over 200 small to mid-sized companies and quietly flagged red flags their executives probably hadn't noticed yet. Then I reverse-engineered what those companies needed, what I would have pitched to them if I still had a boardroom and a title. But I didn't. I had a whiteboard from Craigslist and 3 different color markers. It was enough. 3 months in, I brought in the first person. Elena, a UX strategist I'd worked with once during a product overhaul. She'd been laid off last year, after pushing for more inclusive design in a finance app run by men who'd never needed accessibility tools. She thought I was calling to commiserate. I wasn't. I asked her one question. If you could build something that actually changed how companies treated their customers and their people, what would it look like? She didn't speak for 5 full seconds. Then she said, "It wouldn't look like anything that exists now." We stayed on the phone for 3 hours. She joined without a contract. Just a verbal agreement and a promise. We built quiet power. A week later, Malik joined us. An old colleague turned data whisperer who left the corporate world after his manager took credit for an AI model he'd built from scratch. They called us bitter, washed up, uncooperative. We wore those labels like armor. Together, we began sketching the framework of what we would become. We didn't chase headlines or incubators. We built in silence. We named the company Florent, a word that meant to bloom, in the language of something half forgotten. There was no website yet, just a shared drive, encrypted folders, and a Slack thread called What They Missed. Every week, we reviewed a different client lost by the big firms. We dissected their mistakes like surgeons: tone-deaf messaging, outdated customer experience models, broken internal comms. We realized what no one else wanted to admit. Companies weren't failing because of poor products. They were failing because they treated people like problems to be solved instead of relationships to be earned. That's what we would fix. And we'd start by offering what the giants couldn't. Empathy-driven intelligence. Not performative. Not templated. Real fluid strategy rooted in emotional awareness and micropattern recognition. I wrote the first draft of our mission statement at 2:11 a.m., lit only by my laptop glow. We make the human part work better. 6 months in, we launched a beta with one small client, an education platform losing subscribers by the hundreds. We didn't promise growth. We promised clarity. Within 2 months, they'd regained 18% of their lost users and finally understood why their customer journey felt like a maze. Word spread, but not loudly. Just enough for a few emails to trickle in. A wellness startup. A consulting firm. A media platform that had just gone through layoffs and needed help rebuilding culture. One by one we signed them. No sales deck. No fluff. Just clean results. Our rule was simple. We didn't take clients we didn't believe in. If they saw people as numbers, we walked. Every time we walked away, we left a trail they followed anyway. Because what we were doing worked, and they could feel it even if they didn't understand it yet. I still hadn't told anyone where I was. I hadn't posted a thing. Let them wonder. Let them assume I'd crumbled, disappeared, gone soft. I was used to being underestimated. But now I wasn't just surviving it, I was weaponizing it. And every time we signed a new contract, I checked to see if the client had once been on their roster. Not all were. But some were. And those were the sweetest ones. I kept a private list. I called it the quiet wins. Every time a name landed there, I smiled just a little. Not out of pettiness. Out of precision. Out of proof. Out of the quiet. Something brutal and beautiful was blooming. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful, it feels surgical. That was the kind I lived in. The silence between late-night keystrokes and early morning strategy calls. The silence that stretched between heartbeat and breakdown. Where there was no applause, no performance. Just me and the raw mechanics of belief. My face aged that year subtly but irreversibly. Not in the way grief ages you, but in the way pressure carves new bone beneath the skin. I stopped needing validation. I stopped checking if my words landed gently enough to be palatable. Instead, I spoke only when it mattered, and when I did, it cut clean. The more they underestimated us, the more precise we became. Our systems weren't pretty, they were uncomfortably honest. Clients came to us for retention metrics, but we showed them betrayal maps. Micro-abandonments. Ego leaks. Blind spots their leadership couldn't name because they'd never been on the receiving end of their own culture. And when they asked how we knew, I only ever smiled and said, "We listen." I started working out for the first time in years. Not to sculpt anything, not to burn anything off, but to feel the architecture of myself again. Strength, I learned, was invisible at first. It revealed itself in the days you didn't want to move but did anyway. In the sweat that burned through self-doubt and left behind something cleaner, leaner, quieter. My body stopped flinching when people spoke too loudly. My hands stopped trembling when I hit send on high-risk emails. There was a moment. 3 sets into a workout, lungs burning. When I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Not because she was different, but because she looked like someone who couldn't be broken anymore. The softness was still there, but it had teeth now. I wasn't healing. I was recalibrating. I was rebuilding the parts of myself that had been edited out of conference rooms and pitch decks. And I knew viscerally that this version of me was not going to be digestible. She would not be a fit. She would be a force. Florent grew, but not in the ways startups usually did. There were no launch parties, no glossy PR features. We scaled through whisper networks and overdue trust. Every time we helped a company recover what they'd lost, connection, credibility, coherence, they told someone else. Word of mouth became our bloodline. Our work was too sharp, too specific, too emotionally fluent to be mass-marketed. And that was the point. We weren't building for everyone. We were building for the companies still capable of evolving, still humble enough to say, "We got it wrong." We didn't talk in abstractions. We gave names to what most leaders pretended they couldn't see. Emotional friction, performative feedback loops, weaponized transparency. Our insights hit like confessions. And when clients implemented them, their numbers improved. Not just revenue, retention, morale, belonging. The things you can't fake on a slide deck. That was our edge. And no one else could replicate it. Because no one else had been exiled like we had. Scar tissue made us accurate. Sometimes I had dreams about the old boardroom. Not nightmares, more like hauntings. The table always gleamed too brightly. And someone was always talking over me while nodding like they were listening. In the dream I didn't fight. I just watched. And every time, I woke up with the same phrase in my head. They don't know what you've become. That sentence stayed with me like a spine. It turned up when I was cold emailing a CEO I once worked under. When I was rewriting a case study at 3 a.m. When I was sitting across from a venture capitalist who smiled too wide and asked if I had a male co-founder to help balance things out. I told him no, I didn't. He didn't invest. I didn't flinch. I stopped trying to convince anyone. I stopped translating. If they didn't see it, they didn't deserve it. And that clarity made everything move faster, cleaner, sharper, like a blade that had finally found its edge. Then came the milestone I didn't see coming. One of our newest clients, a sustainability startup on the brink of collapse, sent us an urgent message. We need you to speak at our partner roundtable. Tell them what you told us. I almost said no. Speaking publicly again felt dangerous, like returning to a scene of a crime where I was both victim and witness. But something inside me whispered, go. The day of the event I wore all black. No brand colors, no soft pastels, no corporate mask. When I stepped onto that stage, something changed. The room didn't silence me. It held me. I spoke not like a strategist but like someone who had bled for this truth. I told them that emotional intelligence wasn't a nice to have. It was a survival metric. That culture wasn't built in all-hands meetings. It was built in the invisible moments no one tracked. When I finished, they didn't clap right away. They just stared. And in that pause, I felt something split open. Not fear. Not pride. Power. That night, we got 3 client requests and 1 partnership offer. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that I didn't feel small afterward. I didn't question my tone. I didn't scan the room for signs I'd overstepped. That instinct, the one that had been surgically installed by years of shrinking myself to be tolerable, was gone. I went home, poured a glass of wine, and wrote 1 sentence in the journal that started it all. I don't need to be liked. I need to be unignorable. From that point on, everything accelerated. We built out 2 more core products, hired 5 full-time staff, and implemented an internal policy I'd always dreamed of: restorative review cycles. No more forced rankings. No more silent punishments. Just conversations that centered repair, not performance. It was radical. It was deeply human. It worked. The first scar I ever got in business wasn't from failure, it was from betrayal. That truth never left me. It informed every decision I made, every feature we built, every policy we introduced. I didn't want to recreate the old system. I wanted to gut it from the inside. And that required building something that could hold the complexity of emotion, of error, of evolution. That was our real product. A way forward that didn't require you to become less of yourself to succeed. And for the first time in my career, I wasn't surviving the system. I was rewriting it. It started with a name I hadn't seen in years. Buried in the sender line of an email flagged as Network Outreach. There it was, Shannon D., Chief Marketing Officer, Vireo Group. She'd been my direct superior once. Always immaculate. Always 5 seconds ahead in meetings. Always smiling too hard when she corrected me. She was the one who first told me to round off my edges if I wanted executive presence. The subject line was vague. Let's reconnect? But the body said more than it meant to. She'd been following my work, said she admired the bold direction Florent was taking, and wanted to explore possible synergies. No mention of the severance. No mention of how she'd watched me get cut loose without lifting a finger. Just casual intrigue. Just breadcrumbs laced with history. I didn't reply. Not right away. I sat back in my chair, letting the full weight of it settle. They'd seen me now. Not just glimpsed, but recognized. And whether they admitted it or not, they were circling back, because I had something they needed. A week later, Malik forwarded a calendar invite that made my stomach tighten. Annual Global Strategy Summit, Speaker Selection Committee Briefing. It was an industry staple. Same conference, where I'd once been assigned to take notes in the back, while someone else presented my data. Sponsored in part by Vireo Group. I hadn't applied. Someone had submitted my name under Transformational Strategy Leaders. I almost declined on instinct. But Elena stopped me mid-sentence. Don't rob yourself of being seen, just because they only look when it benefits them, she said. Her voice didn't rise, didn't soften. It was a mirror. And it was right. I clicked accept. 3 days later I got the official offer. Keynote slot. Primetime. All expenses covered. No panel, no moderator. Just me and a stage. And the people who once deemed me unlettable, unscalable, too emotional. I stared at the screen so long my tea went cold beside me. Then I opened the journal and wrote. Return doesn't mean revert. I arrived the night before the conference alone. The hotel lobby reeked of old ambition and lemon polish. Everyone there looked like someone trying to be someone else. Press suits, badge lanyards, voices half a pitch too high. I checked in under a pseudonym. Not out of paranoia, out of control. I didn't want to be intercepted, congratulated prematurely, or roped into hallway nostalgia by someone who hadn't thought of me in years. Up in my room, I laid my outfit on the bed like armor.
No designer labels.
Just clean lines, dark tones, nothing to apologize for. I rehearsed the opening line of my speech out loud once, then again, until it no longer trembled in my throat. I want to talk about the cost of emotional repression in leadership. Not a quote, not a statistic, just a wound made legible. This wasn't about revenge. Not exactly. This was about narrative reclamation, about taking the story they told about me and burning it from the inside. The morning of the keynote, I skipped breakfast. The nerves weren't fear, they were voltage. In the green room, I didn't pace. I wrote. Last-minute edits, recalibrations, truths that suddenly sharpened. At 9:02 a.m., the coordinator waved me to the wings. From the curtain edge, I scanned the crowd. 4th row right side Shannon. Straight posture, tablet in hand. 2 seats down David. The CEO who once praised me for having backbone. Then said nothing while HR rewrote my fate in a closed-door meeting. I let my gaze slide past them. I wasn't here for them, not really. I was here for the quiet ones in the back. The ones still in it. The ones who hadn't left yet, but were starting to wonder if they could. I took a breath so deep it cracked something open in my chest, and walked out into the lights. The applause was polite, obligatory, hollow. Perfect. I didn't need their approval to fill the space. I only needed the truth. I began slowly, without flair. When I was let go from a firm not unlike some represented in this room, the reason given was that I lacked emotional regulation under pressure. I was told it was not a reflection of my talent, but of my tone. I paused. Silence. Real silence. I let it stretch uncomfortably long. Then I smiled, not kindly. What they didn't realize is that tone is how pressure speaks truth. And ignoring it costs more than you think. I walked them through case studies, none named but all real. I showed them what disconnection looked like in metrics. What passive silencing did to retention. What emotional dishonesty did to leadership pipelines. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't pace. I stood still and spoke like someone who no longer needed to be convincing. I already was. Halfway through, I saw Shannon shift in her seat. Not dramatically, just enough to register discomfort. The data was landing. So was the subtext. I didn't flinch. I delivered the final slide with quiet ferocity. What you dismiss as over-emotional is often just unspoken intelligence. And the companies who survive the next 10 years will be the ones who stop mistaking silence for stability. This time the applause wasn't polite. It wasn't even immediate. It was startled, then loud, then sustained. I didn't bow. I nodded once, stepped off stage and didn't look back. In the green room I stared at myself in the mirror. My hands were steady. I thought I'd cry. I didn't. The part of me that once needed their permission had finally died. That afternoon I sat alone in the hotel cafe with a black coffee and a notebook, jotting down every post-speech conversation request and brand inquiry. There were many. Some from VCs. Some from clients I hadn't even known were in the room. But the one that landed hardest came via folded note, slipped under my cup by a staffer. No name. Just handwriting I hadn't seen in years. You were always meant to lead. I see that now. No signature. No apology. Just a truth delivered too late. I folded it twice and slid it into my coat pocket. I wouldn't frame it. I wouldn't answer it, but I'd keep it. Not as a token of validation, but as a receipt. The first person to approach me after the keynote wasn't press, wasn't an investor, wasn't even a stranger. It was David. He moved like a man rehearsing ease, like someone who still believed posture could cover history. The same man who once led Monday meetings with a smirk and called me intense when I questioned his strategic forecasts. He extended a hand I didn't take, just stood there, grinning like we were old colleagues meeting by accident, like we'd shared something more than silence and polite erasure. "You really know how to hold a room," he said, as if this was admiration and not amends in disguise. I didn't smile. I didn't rescue him with small talk. I let the silence linger until it turned uncomfortable. Then I said, "I always did. You just didn't like where I pointed it." He blinked the way people do when they think they're owed grace. Then he laughed too loudly and muttered something about drinks later. I turned before he finished the sentence. By the time I returned to the conference floor, the tone had shifted. People looked at me differently. Not as a disruptor or a curiosity, but as gravity. They leaned in. They asked better questions. I answered the ones that mattered. But beneath the recognition was something colder, sharper. I could feel the pulse of my old firm trying to recalculate me. I passed 2 Vireo employees at a booth discussing whether they should get a meeting with her before legal signs off. That was the game now. My presence wasn't ignorable. So the new strategy would be containment, soft assimilation, turn the threat into a partner, dilute the edge. I'd seen it before. And this time I had no interest in playing nice. Later that evening I was asked to join a small, invite-only dinner for select speakers and legacy contributors. The kind of gathering where brand deals were born over steak and emotionally performative wine lists. I knew I'd find them there. But I said yes anyway. I wore a midnight blue suit with no jewelry, no softness. The host tried to seat me 3 spots away from Shannon. I moved the name cards without asking. When I sat beside her, she looked up, startled, then composed. "You're causing quite a stir," she said, with that clipped elegance I remembered. I sipped my water. "I'm not here to stir. I'm here to excavate." She tilted her head like she might be impressed or offended. Maybe both. The conversation turned to industry trends. I let her lead for a while. Watched how she curated her insights, still so careful to appear collaborative, never revolutionary. When she finally asked me what I thought, I looked her dead in the eye and said, "The industry isn't broken. It's emotionally dishonest. We aren't lagging in innovation. We're lagging in accountability." She laughed, then paused like she realized too late that I wasn't joking. The table fell awkwardly quiet. I didn't fill the silence. I let it do its work. Afterward, as we were all rising to leave, she touched my arm lightly and said, "You've come a long way." Her tone was meant to be generous. It wasn't. It was a reminder that she still saw herself as the point of origin. That my success, in her eyes, was a deviation from the narrative she had once authorized. I leaned in, my voice low but flat.
No, Shannon.
You just stayed still long enough to become irrelevant. I didn't come a long way. I just stopped waiting. Her hand dropped. Her face froze. I walked out before she could reply. Back in my hotel room, I stood by the window for a long time, watching the lights of a city that once held me hostage in the form of ambition. I thought about all the years I'd been trained to apologize for my instincts, to translate urgency into palatability, to preface every sharp observation with a soft disclaimer. And now, in the very rooms that once filtered me out, I was being quoted, echoed, feared. Not because I'd changed, but because I'd stopped making myself smaller. That's what they were confronting now. Not my data, not my delivery, but the fact that I had survived the fire they thought would burn me out, and I'd come back wielding it. The next morning, I was invited to a closed-door panel meant only for legacy executives and emerging leaders. A bridging conversation, a power recalibration. I wasn't planning to attend. But then Malik texted me a screenshot of a Slack message from one of our junior team members. Her speech made me stay. I was going to quit this week. That was it. That was enough. I walked into the panel room 20 minutes late. No apology, just presence. David was moderating. Of course. He looked up mid-sentence, blinked twice, and gestured for someone to find me a seat. I stood instead. "I won't stay long," I said. "I just wanted to leave you with a question." Every head turned. I could feel the weight of every title in the room. I asked, "If your culture was a person, would you trust them with your truth?" Silence. Stillness. Then one man actually said, "I'm not sure I even know what that means." I smiled. "That's why your best people are already leaving." I walked out before anyone else could speak. The message had been delivered, and this time, no one could water it down. The first headline hit 3 days after the conference ended. Keynote sparks leadership reckoning. Is emotional intelligence the next competitive advantage? They didn't name me in the title, but the article was full of veiled references. A former executive ousted for perceived tone issues now leads one of the fastest-growing consultancies in the empathy tech space. They'd wrapped my narrative in clean language, sanitized just enough to make it digestible for the same people who once called my approach too idealistic. But it didn't matter. The story was out, and beneath the sleek praise was a whisper I'd waited years to hear. They were wrong about her. I didn't smile. I didn't repost it. I just read it once, closed the tab, and went back to work. Vindication is loudest in silence. Internally, we braced. Florence inbox doubled in volume within the week. Press inquiries, interview requests, new client consults, and one message from a legacy firm we'd studied early in our formation. The subject line read, "Can we schedule time?" I flagged it and didn't respond. Some ghosts didn't deserve resurrection. More meaningful were the emails from employees, real people, inside systems we'd never touched. Some long, some short. One said only, "I cried during your speech. You said the thing no one says." That one I read twice. Forwarded it to Elena with no subject line. She replied 5 minutes later. "We're not just building tools. We're giving people their voices back." That stayed with me. It was never just about revenge. It was about recovery. And now the ripple had started. But Vireo didn't stay quiet for long. 2 weeks post-keynote, an internal memo from their leadership team was leaked. An email blast to senior staff that read like damage control written by committee. Buzzwords stuffed between reassurances. Doubling down on cultural intelligence. Revisiting communication frameworks. Committed to reevaluating our leadership development pipeline. It was transparent, but not in the way they intended. There was no mention of my name. No direct acknowledgement of the keynote. Just an echo. A defensive tremor. And that tremor was all I needed to know. They felt it. For the first time, they couldn't write me out of the narrative. And every word they didn't say was a testament to how carefully they were now speaking. The next crack came from a former colleague, Ryan, who messaged me privately. He'd been silent since I left. We'd never been close, but we'd respected each other. He was the kind of guy who played it safe, kept his head down, got promoted by mastering inoffensiveness. His message was brief. "I've been thinking about what happened, and about what I didn't say. I should have said something back then. I stared at it for a long time. The apology wasn't wrong, but it was late. And something in me had lost the hunger for retroactive courage. Still," I replied, "then say something now. Say it to the people still inside." He didn't answer right away. But a week later, I saw his name attached to a whistleblower report on Glassdoor, detailing Vireo's silent exit strategy for female leadership.
No fanfare.
No follow-up message. But I saw it. I saw him finally. Our client roster grew at a pace that forced us to restructure operations. We implemented waitlists, hired a second cohort of consultants, launched an in-house training arm we named Relational Fluency, designed for organizations that didn't just want to plug holes, they wanted to evolve. But with growth came shadows. A VC firm that had previously passed on us now came knocking, offering terms I'd once have considered generous. I told them no. Twice. The second time they called directly. The managing partner, a woman named Diane, said, "We're not trying to dilute you. We just want to help you scale faster." I asked her one question. "Why now?" There was a pause. Then she said, "Because we finally see it. The market's changed. You were just early." I ended the call politely. What she called early, I called deliberate. We'd waited for the world to catch up. And now that it had, we didn't need saving. We needed protection. From dilution, from mimicry, from being absorbed by the very machine we were re-engineering. At night, I started writing again, not for strategy, but for memory. In the same leather journal that started it all, I began documenting not just what we were building, but why it mattered. The micro moments. The first time a client broke down during a debrief. The time one of our own analysts admitted they'd stayed at Florent longer than any job, because this place doesn't punish being human. I wrote down every name that came to us from an old referral pipeline tied to Vireo. I logged them in a separate section titled Returns. I didn't track them for ego. I tracked them for clarity, proof that transformation is not always loud, not always public, but always traceable. And the trace always leads back to fracture. They cracked something open when they let me go. They thought it would break me. Instead, it made me into something they couldn't replicate. And now, they were tracing my steps with borrowed language and palatable remorse. Then came the moment I didn't anticipate. The conference organizers reached out again. Not for a follow-up speech. Not for a quote. They wanted me to consult on next year's theme. You shifted the tone, the director said. We want to be more intentional this time. I paused before answering. I thought about how many years I'd sat on the outside of those decisions, watching as others shaped the narrative, watered it down, made it palatable for power. And now they were handing me the pen. Not because they believed in the story, because they'd seen what happened when it was told without them. I told them I'd think about it. Then I called Elena and said, "It's happening." She didn't ask what. She just said, "I know." And for the first time I realized we weren't pushing against the system anymore. The system had started to bend. The reckoning didn't arrive with headlines or lawsuits. Came through inboxes, whispers, forwarded screenshots, Slack messages from interns and assistants who had watched, listened, and finally decided to speak. It began with one document. A Google Drive folder accidentally left public for 72 hours. A compilation of internal personnel tone assessments, quietly used at Vireo to track who was considered stable under pressure. I was in it. So were at least a dozen others I recognized. Every note was the same breed of condescension. Too reactive when challenged. Emotionally attached to outcome. Unsuited for long-term leadership trajectory. These weren't performance reviews. They were quiet executions. My hands didn't shake when I read my entry. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just sat there perfectly still and thought they actually documented the erasure. I closed the tab and called Malik. I didn't say hello. Just, it's time. We didn't publish the files. We didn't need to. All it took was verification. A few corroborating testimonies. A former HR associate who'd been pushed out after questioning the tone tracking criteria agreed to speak anonymously. A junior manager who'd once forwarded my internal feedback forms to himself before I was let go confirmed they'd been altered. We gathered it all, wrapped it in an airtight timeline, and handed it to the one journalist who'd actually listened when no one else had cared. A woman named Layla, who ran a quietly brutal column on systemic corporate bias. She didn't sensationalize. She exposed. And 3 weeks later, her article dropped with a headline that didn't flinch. The Algorithm of Erasure. How Corporate Culture Silences Women Who Lead. My name was in the second paragraph. Not as a victim. As the case study. As the origin of fire. The story detonated in slow waves. LinkedIn turned into a battlefield of long-winded think pieces, half-baked apologies, and executives pretending to grapple with nuance while quietly scrubbing their past posts for contradictions. Some said they were shocked. Others claimed they'd always admired the emotional labor of marginalized leaders. But the most revealing were the ones who said nothing, who went dark, who waited for it to pass. Vireo released a statement crafted by someone who clearly thought accountability was a marketing strategy. They said they were undertaking a third-party audit and recommitting to internal equity. There were no names.
No apologies.
Just phrasing as hollow as the conference rooms they came from. But the audit wasn't the story anymore. The story was the women, dozens now, coming forward with their own receipts. Emails, exit interviews, performance reviews marked perceived volatility, next to phrases like high-performing and exceeds expectations. The thread had unraveled. The pattern was undeniable. And the silence they'd once used to bury us had become the loudest evidence of all. Inside Florent we held a different kind of meeting.
No slides. No agenda.
Just a circle of chairs in the common room and one question written on a whiteboard. How do we build systems that protect without erasing? It wasn't theoretical. We had clients who were now asking us to help clean up their reputations. People who'd ignored us 6 months ago now wanted emotional reinvention strategies in exchange for six-figure contracts. We said no. Not because we were vindictive, but because we weren't in the business of redemption as branding. Instead, we created a new clause in all future contracts. Empathy without reform is performance. If they weren't ready to dismantle what made their culture toxic, we weren't for sale. It cost us 4 potential clients in the first week. But it gave our team something stronger than profit. Alignment. Integrity became our growth strategy. And it worked. The fallout wasn't confined to inboxes and articles. At one industry mixer, a young man I didn't recognize approached me with a drink in one hand and a confession in the other. He said he'd been in the room when my dismissal was being discussed. That he remembered how they laughed after I left. How someone called me a risk they were glad to be rid of. He said he'd been a new hire. That he hadn't known how to intervene. That he still thought about it. I didn't comfort him. I didn't ease his guilt. I just said, then make sure you never sit quietly in a room like that again. His face crumpled. And maybe, in some small way, the version of him who'd sat silent in that boardroom finally left his body. I kept working. I kept building. But part of me began to burn out. Not from the labor, but from the constant re-triggering. Every article, every podcast, every panel that now wanted my insight was a reminder that none of this was theory. It was lived. Scarred. Rewritten in my body. There were days I sat at my desk and stared at my hands, wondering how many rooms they'd once trembled in. How many times I'd tried to make myself legible to people who were only ever fluent in power. One night, after a speaking engagement, I returned to my hotel, locked the door, and cried so hard I lost track of time. Not because I was weak, but because I had finally run out of ways to carry strength like a weapon. That was the unraveling no one prepared me for. The aftermath of being right. And still, beneath all of it, was something steady. Something unshakable. I wasn't ashamed of the pain. I wasn't even angry at the timing. I was simply done performing resilience. I began turning down speaking requests. Declined features that asked for personal trauma soundbites. I rewrote the rules of engagement, even with our success. Florent didn't need to be everywhere. It needed to be true. So we did fewer things more deeply. Quiet launches. Closed-door community sessions. We stopped scaling for scale's sake. We began planting long-term ecosystems inside our client orgs, systems that could outlive us. I started training our team not to replicate me, but to surpass me. To be more than a symbol. To become structure. And structure, I realized, is what remains after the story stops being told. I didn't go back to the building. Not once. Not even when I passed it during layovers, or saw it tagged in press features, or watched old colleagues post filtered rooftop photos, like trauma hadn't lived inside those walls. The urge faded slowly, the way phantom pain does. There but less urgent with each passing day. Closure, I learned, doesn't arrive as an apology or an open door. It arrives when you no longer seek either. I stopped fantasizing about revenge somewhere around the 5th client we signed from their portfolio. Not because it stopped mattering, but because it no longer defined me. They had tried to extract the emotional marrow from my leadership, and called it scalability. I had built something living, something real, from everything they had discarded. That was enough. More than enough. A year after the keynote, we bought our building. Not flashy. Not in the city center. A quiet structure tucked into an old industrial strip with big windows and exposed beams. The kind of place you could breathe in. I walked through it alone before anyone else did. No cameras, no ribbon cutting. Just me and the sound of footfalls on unfinished floors. I touched the walls like they were alive. Each room held potential, not pressure. Each space was wide enough for voices that had once been asked to shrink. We designed it with no corner offices. No hierarchy baked into architecture. Every meeting room was named after a woman who'd been labeled too emotional, and later changed something permanent: Chimamanda, Audrey, Frida. The kitchen had a long table, meant for long conversations. No one was timed. No one was translated. We didn't hang awards on the walls. Instead, we framed impact letters. Messages from clients and users whose companies were better, because someone inside finally learned how to listen. My favorite was from a client who said, "Your team didn't give us a strategy. You gave us back our people." That one lived in the entrance hallway, handwritten under glass. We didn't measure success by retention metrics alone anymore. We started tracking what we called return rates of voice. How many employees, after working with us, felt safe enough to speak without bracing? It wasn't perfect. It wasn't always clean. But it was real. And no other firm in our category even knew how to define it, let alone measure it. That was our legacy. Not just thought leadership. Felt leadership. I still kept the journal. The original one. The leather-bound survivor that traveled with me through the basement years and blackout nights. I didn't write in it anymore. But I kept it in a drawer near my desk, its pages thick with ink and ghosts. On its last page, I had scrawled just 2 words. Not done. I left it like that. Not as a promise to keep climbing, but as a reminder that closure isn't an end. It's a shift, a recentering, a refusal to let anyone else decide when the story stops. Sometimes I'd open it and just touch the paper, remembering who I'd been when the first page was written. Raw, humiliated, not yet dangerous. I loved her now. Fiercely. She didn't need fixing. She just needed space. There were days I still got angry. Not at them, but at how many thems there were. How systemic it all was. How many women still came to me, whispering versions of my own story with tears held back by professionalism. I couldn't carry them all. I didn't try. Instead, I built tools for them to carry themselves. We launched a fellowship, quietly of course, for emotionally intelligent founders whose ideas have been shelved for being too niche. We didn't ask for pitch decks. Just origin stories. What broke you? What are you building in response to it? The cohort filled in 6 days. Their ideas were messy, poetic, unscalable in the best ways. One woman was building a conflict resolution tool, based entirely on childhood memory. Another was creating an empathy metric, based on tone inflection, not word choice. They weren't building startups. They were building futures. I funded them with my own money first. It felt like alchemy, like lineage. The final message from Vireo came on a Tuesday. An email from their new CEO, woman late 40s, newly installed after the board reshuffle. Her tone was careful, measured, inoffensive. She wanted to acknowledge the harm caused to leaders like you in years past, and hoped for a constructive dialogue. I read it twice, then closed my laptop. Not out of rage, out of clarity. There was nothing left to say. My story didn't live in their inbox anymore. It lived in the way I answered calls from women who whispered. They said I was too much. It lived in the way I looked them in the eyes and said, then they weren't enough. My reply to the CEO was short. 2 sentences. Thank you for reaching out. We're not interested in partnerships at this time. On my last night in the old apartment, before I moved closer to the new office, I stood in the kitchen with the original cardboard box. The same one from the day I was let go. It had survived every relocation, every storm. Inside were the objects that didn't change. The photo of my sister and me, the lavender sachet, the unused stress ball. I added one more item before sealing it, the original termination letter. I didn't frame it. I didn't burn it. I just folded it into the box like a chapter closed. Not erased, closed. Then I slid the box into a storage shelf labeled Archive, Origins. I didn't need it in sight anymore. Its power had already been transmuted. Some people think rebirth feels like flight. For me, it felt like weight redistribution. Like I wasn't carrying less, but I was finally carrying what was mine. The truth. The rage. The joy. The voice. All of it. I walked out of that apartment not like a phoenix, but like a woman who had walked through fire and decided to stay warm. If you've ever been called too emotional, or made to shrink so someone else could feel bigger, this story was for you. Drop a comment if you've lived it. Share this with the one friend who needs to hear it. And if you're still quiet right now, don't worry. They'll hear you soon enough. Subscribe for more stories that don't just entertain, they remember you. See you soon in our next story.